It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the sun hits the pastures just right, turning the tall grass golden and calm. My ranch had always been my pride, acres of open land stretching past the horizon, where my cattle grazed peacefully and the creek cut a narrow line through the property before feeding into the main reservoir. I built this place from the ground up, inherited a small piece from my grandfather and expanded it over the years. Every fence post, every barn beam, every irrigation line, I knew it all by heart. So when I saw a group of construction trucks parked along my southern fence line that morning, I knew immediately something was wrong. At first, I thought they might have gotten lost or maybe a contractor had mixed up the address. But when I got closer, I saw men in reflective vests unloading pipes, machinery humming, and an excavator already tearing into the ground. They weren't lost. They were building something. I pulled up in my truck, dust kicking up behind me, and honked to get their attention. A few workers glanced up but didn't stop. One of them, probably the foreman, walked over and waved like this was just another day on the job. "Morning, sir. We'll be out of your way soon," he said cheerfully, wiping sweat off his forehead. "What exactly are you doing on my land?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked at his clipboard and said matter-of-factly, "Installing a new water pipeline for the Lakeview Homeowners Association. Shouldn't he take more than a few days?" I blinked, trying to process his words. "Lakeview HOA, that's 2 miles down the road. You're on private property. Did you get permission from me or the county?" He frowned slightly, checking his paperwork. "According to our map, this is public utility access. HOA said we had clearance." That's when I felt the heat rising in my chest. "Well, your map's wrong," I said, pointing to the fence line behind him. "Everything past that marker is mine. You're trespassing." The foreman looked uncomfortable but didn't call off his crew. "You might want to take that up with the HOA board, sir. We just do what we're told." With that, he turned and shouted something to the workers, and they kept digging like I hadn't said a word. I drove straight back to the ranch house and started calling the HOA office. It took 3 attempts before someone finally answered, a woman who sounded like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Yes, this is the Lakeview HOA office," she said in that clipped tone bureaucrats use when they think they're in charge. I introduced myself and told her that their construction team was on my property without authorization. She paused, then replied curtly, "Sir, the pipeline project was approved months ago. That land falls under the HOA's community utility plan." I nearly laughed out loud. "No, ma'am. That land is privately owned by me. I have the deeds to prove it. Your people are trespassing." She huffed. "Sir, our president assured me that everything is legally permitted. If you have an issue, you'll need to bring it up at our next board meeting." Then she hung up. I stared at the phone in disbelief. The nerve of these people. I went back outside and watched the workers continue digging, oblivious to the fact that they were breaking multiple laws. One of my ranch hands, Luis, walked over and asked, "Boss, you want me to call the sheriff?" I thought about it but shook my head. "Not yet. Let's see how deep they want to dig their own hole first." By evening, they had already installed a few segments of pipe-thick black PVC running right through my pasture. I drove the property line again, marking every area they had disturbed. It was about 300 yards of trench, perfectly aligned with the natural slope that fed into the creek. They weren't just passing through, they were rerouting water flow. That meant potential damage to my irrigation, erosion to the soil, and contamination of my livestock's water source. I snapped photos, recorded video, and made sure to get every license plate in sight. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was preparing for war. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office. It was located in a modern-looking building in their gated neighborhood, all polished glass and fake smiles. I asked to speak with the HOA president, a woman named Marlene, who apparently was the one behind the pipeline project. She came out wearing a bright pink blazer, holding a coffee cup that said "Boss Lady," which told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "Can I help you?" she said in that sweet, condescending tone people use when they're about to lie to your face. "You can start by explaining why your crew is building a pipeline on my land," I said flatly. Her smile faded slightly. "That's not possible. The land was designated for community use. It's on our plans." "Your plans are wrong," I said. "The land isn't yours, never has been, and the county records will back that up. You're trespassing, and if your workers don't stop by the end of the day, I'll have them removed." Her expression hardened. "Sir, threatening an HOA project can result in legal consequences. You're interfering with public utility work." I almost laughed again. "Public utility? You mean the illegal trench your team is digging through private property without a single permit?" She blinked, clearly not expecting me to know what I was talking about. "You'll regret this," she snapped, before turning on her heel and walking away. As I drove back home, the anger in me turned into something sharper: determination. These people thought they could bully and bluff their way through anything. They thought because they were an HOA, they had real power. But what they didn't know was that they had just crossed the worst possible line. I spent that evening reviewing my own business files. You see, what Marlene and her board didn't realize was that the community water supply they were trying to tap into came directly from the utility company my family owned, the same one that serviced their entire development. Their water flowed through my company's system, managed by my employees, and billed under my authority. They had no idea the man they just angered was the one responsible for keeping their sprinklers, showers, and pools running. As I sat at my desk, reviewing the legal maps and pipeline permits, I couldn't help but smile. I wasn't just going to make them stop. I was going to make them understand what happens when arrogance meets reality. The HOA had built a pipeline through my land without permission, and soon, they were going to find out exactly who they had messed with. The next morning, I woke up with one goal in mind: to find out just how deep this HOA's arrogance went. After the confrontation with Marlene, I had a feeling this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, it was deliberate. I brewed a pot of coffee, grabbed my laptop, and sat down in my office, determined to uncover the truth. The first thing I did was check the county's permit database. Every legal construction project, especially something involving a water line, requires approval from the county water authority. It didn't take long to find that there were no permits issued to the Lakeview HOA for any kind of pipeline installation. None. Not for this year, not for the last 5 years. That meant their entire project was not only unauthorized, it was completely illegal. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization sink in. They weren't just trespassing on my land, they were tampering with public utilities. That was a crime. I decided to drive down to the county records office to confirm it in person. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Tony who had helped me with property filings before, looked over the maps I brought with me. He pointed to the thick boundary line marking my ranch's edge and then to the pipeline route I had photographed. "Yep," he said, tapping the paper. "This area here is all private. No utility easements, no public right-of-way. Whoever dug that trench had no business being there. I asked him about the HOA's supposed construction permit. He checked the system again, shaking his head. Nothing here under their name. If they told you they were approved, they're lying. I thanked him and left with copies of the records. As I got back into my truck, I started connecting the dots in my head. The HOA had no permit, no legal access, and yet they were still installing pipes that had to connect somewhere. But where the only logical answer was the main water grid that serviced their community, and that grid was managed by my company, Clear Water Supply Co. My grandfather had founded Clear Water decades ago, and I had taken over operations 10 years back. We provided water to several rural and suburban areas, including the Lakeview development. If they were installing a pipeline, it meant they were tying into one of our main lines without authorization. That night, I called my operations manager, Frank, and asked him to pull the latest water usage data for the Lakeview area. When the report came in, it confirmed my suspicion there was an unexplained spike in output from one of our southern pumps, the one that ran along the property line bordering my ranch. It had started the same day the construction began. I felt my jaw tighten. They were stealing water from my system. I drove out to the pump station myself, flashlight in hand. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets and the sound of running water through the main pipe. I followed the flow line toward the edge of my land where the new trench had been dug. Sure enough, there it was, a shiny new pipe, freshly installed and connecting directly into my company's system. I crouched down, tracing the connection point. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. They had used industrial-grade connectors and even painted over the junction to make it look older than it was. This wasn't amateur work. Someone had planned this carefully, hoping no one would notice. I took several photos and videos, documenting every inch of it. As I stood there under the moonlight, I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. They had built an illegal pipeline through my property and were siphoning my company's water like it was theirs to take. I had given them the benefit of the doubt before, thinking maybe this was a mix-up, a paperwork issue, or miscommunication. But now, it was clear they thought they were untouchable. The next day, I called an emergency meeting with my company's legal team. We met in the boardroom at Clearwater headquarters, and I laid out all the evidence, photos of the trench, the connection point, the HOA letters, and the county's confirmation that no permits existed. My head of legal, Dana, looked furious. "They're tapping into a regulated water source without authorization," she said. "That's theft and violation of state utility law. We can have them fined heavily, maybe even prosecuted." I nodded but didn't say anything for a moment. My mind was already a few steps ahead. "Let's hold off on legal filings for now," I said finally. "I want to handle this my way first." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You sure you've got them cornered already?" I smiled slightly. "Oh, I'm sure. But I want them to see what happens when you steal from someone who actually owns the water they drink." That afternoon, I drove back to the HOA neighborhood. As I passed through the gate, I could see banners and flyers promoting their new sustainable water system plastered all over the community notice boards. They were bragging about the very pipeline they had stolen from me. It was almost laughable. I parked near the community clubhouse and walked inside. They were holding a small event, the HOA board, a few local residents, even a contractor giving a presentation about efficient water distribution. The room fell silent when I entered. Marlene spotted me first, her fake smile instantly vanishing. "You can't be here," she said coldly. "This is a members-only meeting." I ignored her and held up a folder. "I think you'll want to hear this." A few board members shifted uncomfortably as I laid out the photos on the table: the pipeline trench, the unpermitted construction, and the illegal connection to my company's water grid. "This," I said, pointing to the last photo, "is theft. You're not just on my property without permission, you're stealing water from a private utility. And that utility happens to belong to me." The room was dead silent. Marlene's face drained of color. "You're lying," she whispered, but her voice shook. "We have authorization." "From who?" I asked calmly. "Because the county has no record. My company has no record. And every gallon of water that flows through that pipe is metered and billed through Clear Water Supply Co., which I own. So unless you have a second permit from the state, what you're doing is illegal." One of the board members, a man who looked like he regretted ever showing up, spoke up nervously. "We were told this was just an extension of existing lines. The contractor said it was approved." I looked him in the eye. "Then your contractor lied to you." Marlene tried to gather herself, straightening her blazer and raising her chin. "You can't just accuse us of crimes. We're an HOA. We have rights." I smiled faintly. "Yes, you do. And so do I. You have until tomorrow to remove every piece of pipe from my property and disconnect from my system. If you don't, I'll have your entire neighborhood's water supply shut off until further notice." That got their attention. The murmurs in the room turned to panic. "You can't do that," one woman exclaimed. "We'll sue you." "You're welcome to try," I said, turning toward the door. "But before you do, check who signs your water bill every month." I left them there, stunned and speechless. As I drove home, the setting sun reflected across the fields, casting a warm orange glow over the land. I couldn't help but think about how satisfying it was to turn the tables. They thought they could control me, push me around with false authority. What they didn't know was that I had control over something far more powerful: the very water that kept their homes running. The pieces were all in place now. Tomorrow, they'd learn what real ownership meant. The realization that I controlled the very source of water for the HOA's pipeline sent a jolt of disbelief through me at first, but as the shock wore off, a surge of empowerment and strategy began to form in my mind. For years, I had been blissfully unaware that my ownership extended beyond the ranch itself to the company that supplied water to the very community that had encroached on my land. The thought that the HOA, which had moved forward with construction on my property without my explicit permission, was now inadvertently dependent on me for the resource they presumed was independent, shifted the entire dynamic in my favor. Initially, I had approached the situation with caution, meticulously reviewing contracts, deeds, and corporate records to ensure that my control was legitimate and enforceable. Every clause mattered, and the intricacies of water rights, easements, and municipal regulations became both a challenge and a weapon. Once I confirmed that my ownership was absolute, I began to contemplate how to approach the HOA without creating unnecessary hostility while ensuring that my interests were protected. I realized that any confrontation had to be grounded in fact, authority, and leverage rather than emotion, because these bureaucratic entities often responded only to clear demonstration of control and potential consequences. The next step involved assembling a clear record of the timeline of events, when the HOA had begun surveying and constructing on my property, how much of the pipeline intersected with my land, and which communications had taken place or, more accurately, hadn't taken place. Every email, letter, and official notice was scrutinized to highlight the oversight on their part and to lay the groundwork for a negotiation that would inevitably be influenced by my unique position. I reached out to legal counsel specializing in water rights and HOA disputes to ensure that any moves I made would be bulletproof, balancing assertiveness with prudence. While the legal aspects were essential, I also recognized that perception and negotiation tactics were equally critical. I had to present myself as a problem solver rather than an antagonist, someone whose cooperation was invaluable rather than an obstacle to their project. With this dual approach in mind, I prepared a comprehensive communication that outlined the situation, my ownership of the water supply company, the construction that had occurred on my property without authorization, and the potential risks they faced if they continued to operate without formal agreements or acknowledgement of my authority. I made it clear that I was not seeking to punish them but to establish a framework for mutually beneficial collaboration, where my rights were respected and their water needs were securely and legally met. The initial response from the HOA board was a mixture of disbelief and defensiveness. They had assumed that water management was a neutral, external matter and that their pipeline was merely a logistical concern. Once I presented documentation, including property deeds, corporate ownership records, and historical supply agreements, the tone shifted noticeably. They began to realize that their oversight could have legal and operational repercussions if not addressed properly. This shift provided an opening for negotiation, allowing me to propose a solution that aligned their dependency on the water supply with a formal, fair arrangement that recognized my ownership while granting them continued access under defined terms. The process was delicate. I had to assert control without appearing vindictive, ensuring that they understood the seriousness of the oversight while leaving room for a cooperative resolution. In discussions and subsequent meetings, I emphasized transparency, accountability, and the shared interest in maintaining a reliable water supply. I laid out operational guidelines, maintenance responsibilities, and financial arrangements that would guarantee continuity for the HOA while reinforcing my authority as the ultimate supplier. The result was a gradual transformation in the relationship. Where once the HOA had acted unilaterally, now they were engaging with me directly, acknowledging the legitimacy of my ownership and the importance of following proper procedures. I realized that my unique position not only gave me leverage but also required a high degree of responsibility, as any disruption in the water supply could have significant consequences for the community. This duality, power coupled with accountability, became a central theme in my approach, shaping every negotiation and decision that followed. Over time, the HOA came to respect the structure I implemented, recognizing that their compliance was not merely a legal obligation but also a practical necessity to ensure uninterrupted service. I monitored the implementation closely, verifying that construction adjustments were made to protect both the pipeline and my property, and confirming that agreements were documented, signed, and enforceable. Each step reinforced my authority while fostering a cooperative framework that benefited both parties. The experience taught me that leverage in negotiations often comes not from confrontation alone but from a combination of knowledge, documentation, strategic communication, and a willingness to provide mutually advantageous solutions. By transforming what initially appeared to be a conflict into an opportunity for structured collaboration, I was able to secure my interests while creating a sustainable model for future interactions with the HOA. In the end, the pipeline that had once symbolized encroachment and oversight became a conduit for respect, order, and proper recognition of ownership, demonstrating that understanding the full scope of one's rights and responsibilities can dramatically shift the balance of power, even in situations that initially seem overwhelmingly one-sided. The experience left me more attuned to the nuances of property law, corporate ownership, and community governance, and it underscored the importance of vigilance, preparation, and strategic thinking in situations where the stakes involve both legal authority and practical control over essential resources.